The Mr. Olympia 2000 took place in Las Vegas at the iconic Mandalay Bay Arena, marking the 36th edition of the biggest bodybuilding competition in the world. More than just another championship, that event represented a true turning point in the sport's history. Olympia was making it clear that it was entering a new era. Bigger, more extreme, more visual, and more impactful with each passing year. By the end of 2000, bodybuilding was going through a major transformation. The aesthetic standard was shifting fast, and the Olympia stage had become the clearest reflection of that change. Athletes were no longer chasing just classic lines or balanced proportions. Now, the focus was on outrageous size combined with razor-sharp conditioning. The competition was organized by the IFBB and brought together the biggest names in professional bodybuilding at the time. Established champions shared the stage with athletes who, just a few years later, would become absolute legends of the sport. Every comparison, every pose, and every call-out made it obvious that Olympia was no longer just a contest. It was a global spectacle. Once again, Las Vegas was the perfect backdrop for such a historic moment. The city symbolized excess, scale, and visual impact, exactly what bodybuilding had come to represent during that era. The Mandalay Bay Arena was packed, and the crowd knew they were about to witness something special. This wasn't just another Olympia. It was a defining moment. Beyond the prestige, Mr. Olympia 2000 also stood out for its financial impact. That year, the total prize money reached roughly $325,000, an extremely high amount for bodybuilding in the early 2000s. It made one thing very clear. Olympia wasn't just about a symbolic trophy. It was an event that could truly change an athlete's life. The champion of the night walked away with $100,000, a sum that represented the financial peak of a professional bodybuilder's career at the time. Second place earned $55,000, while third place took home $40,000. Those numbers highlighted the brutal gap between standing on top and simply being part of the lineup. That prize money helps explain why the level of competition was so intense. Every athlete who stepped on that stage knew they weren't fighting just for fame, but for financial security, recognition, sponsorships, and worldwide exposure. A strong Olympia result could open doors to magazine covers, DVD deals, seminars, and an entire career beyond the stage. More than anything, the money symbolized the institutional weight of the event. Olympia was the final destination of a whole season filled with sacrifices, brutal diets, exhausting training, and very real physical risks. Everything came down to that one night, where months, sometimes years, of preparation would be judged in just a few minutes under the spotlight. So when we talk about Mr. Olympia prize money, we're not just talking about cash. We're talking about status, legacy, and survival in the sport. Winning Olympia meant becoming part of history. When the comparisons were over and the judges finalized their scores, the results left little room for debate. The podium was clear, consistent, and perfectly matched what the audience had seen on stage. From the very first call-outs, it was already clear that this edition was heading toward an almost unquestionable conclusion. At the top, Ronnie Coleman claimed first place with a unanimous victory, winning every round of the competition. Right behind him was Levone, securing second place with an extremely competitive physique. In third came Flex Wheeler, still impressive, but no longer as dominant as he had been in previous years. Fourth place went to Sean Ray, always known for his consistency and high-level conditioning. Fifth was Nasser El Sambadi, one of the most massive athletes of the era, while Lee Priest took sixth, dividing opinions with his compact yet incredibly dense physique. Even outside the top six, the rest of the lineup drew a lot of attention. Names like Marcus Rule, Jay Cutler, and Dexter Jackson rounded out the top 10, making it clear that the future of bodybuilding was already taking shape on that stage. Some of them were still far from their peak, but the signs were there that they would dominate the years to come. Ronnie Coleman's win at Mr. Olympia 2000 wasn't just another title. It was a statement of absolute dominance. With that result, he secured his third straight Olympia, and he did it in the most decisive way possible, winning every single round of the competition. From the very first comparison, it was obvious the judges were looking at something completely out of the ordinary, almost impossible to beat that night. The near-perfect score turned Ronnie into more than just a champion. Around that time, he started being called Mr. Perfect, a nickname that reflected not only the judges' scorecards, but the overall feeling on stage. The visual gap between him and the rest of the lineup was undeniable, making most comparisons feel almost procedural. Physically, Coleman brought a combination that was still rare back then. His physique blended extreme size, insane muscle density, and brutal conditioning, without completely losing structural balance. It was the kind of body that hit hard even from a distance. He wasn't just big, he looked thick, heavy, and peeled. His legs were one of the biggest shocks of that year. Massive quads, full and deeply etched, paired with equally huge hamstrings, created a lower body that simply had no equal on that stage. His back, with its incredible width and thickness, is still mentioned by many fans and experts as one of the greatest backs in competitive bodybuilding history. To make it all even more unreal, Ronnie stepped on stage weighing around 120 to 121 kilograms, roughly 265 to 267 pounds, in full contest shape. By the standards of the year 2000, that seemed almost impossible, and that's probably why this victory is remembered as one of the most iconic moments in Olympia history. On the other side, Kevin Levone arrived at Mr. Olympia in one of the best shapes of his entire career. On stage, he displayed an extremely balanced physique, with excellent symmetry, full muscles, and a confident presentation that looked solid from the very first pose. For many fans, that was close to the ideal version of Levone. His body showcased the traits that always set him apart: wide shoulders, a dense chest, complete arms, and an overall aesthetic line that was very pleasing to the eye. Unlike athletes who relied purely on size, Levone managed to combine visual power with fluidity, making his poses look both natural and impactful. Still, there was one obstacle that couldn't be ignored. Despite his elite aesthetics and technical quality, Kevin was ultimately outmatched by the sheer volume, density, and physical brutality brought by Ronnie Coleman. It wasn't about obvious weaknesses, it was about scale. The Olympia standard was changing, and the main criterion was starting to favor whoever was bigger and denser. That addition reinforced a label that would follow Levone throughout his career: the greatest bodybuilder to never win the Olympia. Over the years, he would finish second 4 times, always just short of the ultimate title. That turned his legacy into a mix of admiration and frustration among fans. Even without the trophy, Kevin Levone left Olympia 2000 with something very few athletes ever achieve: absolute respect. His presence on that stage proved that aesthetics, balance, and charisma still had a place in the sport, even during the rise of the mass monsters. Further down the standings, Flex Wheeler stepped on stage that year carrying massive expectations. For many fans and experts, he was still considered the most aesthetic bodybuilder of all time, almost flawless in terms of proportion, symmetry, and muscle flow. Because of that, his third-place finish came as a shock and sparked one of the most intense debates of that edition. Visually, Wheeler was still impressive, but something felt different. Critics began pointing out clear signs of decline in his aesthetic quality, especially in the abdominal area. The famous vacuum no longer appeared as naturally, and his midsection looked less controlled compared to his prime years. For an athlete whose trademark was visual perfection, even small flaws became magnified. Another hot topic was the shape of his arms and shoulders. Many observers noticed changes in muscle appearance, with less natural volumes and odd contours in certain poses. That fueled speculation about the excessive use of site enhancement oils, something that, at the time, was becoming an increasingly common subject behind the scenes of the sport. These changes ended up hurting what had always been Flex Wheeler's greatest strength: his classic lines. At a time when the Olympia was starting to value sheer mass and density above everything else, any loss in aesthetics became even more noticeable, especially when compared to brutally massive physiques like Ronnie Coleman's. Another very interesting moment that night was the appearance of Marcus Rule. The reaction was immediate. Even though he finished only 7th place, he became one of the most talked about athletes of the entire show. His physique was impossible to ignore, quite the opposite. The moment he stepped on stage, the impact was instant. You simply couldn't look away from his size and the raw brutality of his structure. The undeniable highlight was his massive shoulders, still considered by many to be among the biggest ever seen in professional bodybuilding. Combined with an incredibly thick torso and huge arms, Rule projected a sense of raw, almost excessive power. He wasn't trying to be elegant or classic. His goal was pure mass, no compromises. That approach split opinions. While judges were still prioritizing certain technical criteria, many fans believed Marcus represented exactly where the sport was headed. To that audience, Olympia was clearly moving toward full appreciation of extreme mass, and Rule was the perfect embodiment of that new era. To this day, his placing is still debated. Many argue he deserved a top 5 spot, not necessarily for refined aesthetics, but for what people call the shock factor, that overwhelming visual impact that redefines standards and shifts expectations. Very few athletes ever walked on stage with a presence as crushing as his. One detail that often goes unnoticed, but had a huge impact on Mr. Olympia 2000, was the absence of Chris Cormier. The year before, in 1999, he had placed third, showing he was ready to fight directly for the top. His absence quietly changed the course of that edition. Cormier suffered a serious injury about 4 weeks before the competition, which made it impossible for him to compete. In a sport where preparation is calculated down to the smallest detail, any physical setback that close to the show usually ends all chances of recovery. Sitting out was unavoidable, but it left a major gap among the top contenders. Chris's absence shifted the competitive balance of the Olympia. He was seen as an athlete capable of battling head-to-head with Flex Wheeler, Kevin Levone, and even putting pressure on Ronnie Coleman in certain areas. Without him on stage, some key comparisons simply never happened. For the fans, there was a lingering what if. Many wondered how he would have looked in a lineup dominated by mass monsters. His physique, known for combining size, density, and strong stage presence, could have directly influenced the top 3, or at the very least changed the dynamics of the final callouts. But the event wasn't remembered only for placings and incredible physiques. It also gave rise to stories that survived the years and turned into bodybuilding legends. Among them, one of the most talked about topics involves the level of conditioning shown by the champion that night, a detail that still sparks debate among fans, athletes, and experts to this day. In interviews after the competition, Ronnie Coleman claimed he stepped on stage at around 0.33% body fat. From a scientific standpoint, that number is virtually impossible for a living human being to maintain, especially under the extreme stress of a bodybuilding contest. Even so, the statement quickly caught on and spread worldwide. More than a technical claim, that number became a metaphor. It helped capture just how dry, dense, and conditioned that physique looked to the audience. Regardless of the accuracy of the figure, the visual message was clear. Coleman brought a level of definition that very few athletes had ever reached at that point. To this day, Mr. Olympia 2000 is remembered as a true turning point in professional bodybuilding. It wasn't just another edition of the world's biggest contest. It was the moment it became clear that the sport had permanently changed direction. After that stage, nothing would ever be judged the same way again. From that point on, Ronnie Coleman fully took over as the dominant force in bodybuilding. Olympia 2000 didn't just confirm his superiority. It marked the beginning of a historic reign that would last nearly a decade. He stopped being just a champion and became the standard by which everyone else would be measured. This event also cemented the final transition into what became known as the Mass Monsters era. The sport's visual criteria shifted in a very clear way. Size, density, and overall impact mattered more than ever. Classic aesthetics were still admired, but they were no longer enough to win at the highest level. Olympia had chosen its new direction. The consequences of that shift were deep and long-lasting. Athletes from the next generations began shaping their physiques around that extreme standard. Judges adjusted the way they evaluated bodies, fans reset their expectations, and professional bodybuilding entered a phase that was more aggressive, heavier, and, for many, far more controversial. That's why, when we look back at Mr. Olympia 2000, we're looking at much more than a result or a champion. We're looking at the exact moment the sport decided who it wanted to be. An Olympia that didn't just make history, but changed history. And that's probably why, so many years later, this edition still sparks so much discussion, admiration, and debate among fans all around the world.